lopsided on the old class today. He needs to invite some of his friends.
You have Asher and Liddy. What
Yeah,
more do you need, right?
He'll take one for the team.
We'll take the hard questions, better give them the easy ones.
That's right. We'll give him the easy ones. All right, we are in John 18. Suddenly we have a new schedule.
Oh, that's right.
So
no comments, quiet again.
no, it's good. In fact, I have a lot to get through. Normally I have one page in 14 font. I got 4 pages
Wow.
in like 7 font. No, I'm kidding. I do want to read you something today that I printed off the internet. We'll get to that here in a minute. But what I want to do, and believe me, comments are always welcome. I don't care if we, it's not like we're going to stop. Like, hey, we're going to stop studying the Bible in 4 weeks. That's not going to happen. So we're gonna be in this. We're gonna do this. I do have to be gone on the 16th of this month just because of our annual disaster recovery test. So that's when the pastor is scheduled to take over. And we'll try to get through this as much as we can before then. Hopefully we'll finish through 21, all the whole chapter.
Speaking of schedule, not to bring this up, but
Yep.
I'm going to comment a lot today. I was thinking maybe, even if that's temporary, I can get through the Trail of Blood, then I can take over Sunday school.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Thoughts on that? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller?
Oh, I thought I was thinking.
Bueller?
Or actually, yeah, because you were going to do that. I was thinking you could do both Sunday, a school and the message for a little while.
Yeah,
You finish up the Trail of Blood, maybe I take over for you, then you take over Sunday school, something like that.
yeah.
And then Brian will take over the second hour.
We got it. I got it. Right? Right?
That's
It's 2017's Brian's
That's the
year.
attitude you like right there.
He's got new clothes, he's ready.
All right.
That's right.
New James, new assignment.
Noah's gonna be on permanent special duty.
Permanent special.
Yes. He's gonna
No
bring
special we know.
every single special every week. All right, so John 18. Last week, I don't want to review too much because we do have a lot to get through. But last week, we did talk about Jesus was arrested, and then he appeared before in verse 19, chapter 18, verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus, up to this point, other than being arrested and bound and led to the high priest, he hasn't been really manhandled yet. Okay, that's what my sheet is going to talk about today. And he hasn't been struck up until this point. Well, in the next couple of verses here, he does. And of course, he gives him an answer and says basically, look, I was out there preaching. I didn't hide anything. This isn't something that my ministry wasn't in secret. Verse 22 says, and when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? And so Jesus' day of abuse has just started. And that's what we're going to see. If we get through it today, we're going to see all those things that come upon. And so we dealt with Peter. Of course, we kind of flash back, from Peter in verse 15 through 18, and then we go back to Jesus, then we go back to Peter, verse 25. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, you were not also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. There's the second time. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. And some of the other gospels include that he went out and he wept, cried his eyes out, because he knew what he had done. And at the moment that he knew it, that's when it really hit him. And I think that's when he left. And during this time, John doesn't record it, but that's when Jesus, as he was being led back and forth, when Peter was in the courtyard there, Jesus was being led out, and that's when he looked over and saw Peter at that third time. And that's when they locked eyes, and he felt really bad. So he went out and he repented of that, I think. He was just so overcome with emotion that he had to weep. And so this is where we're going to start today, verse 28. So Jesus, I have some notes here, but the Jews broke a lot of their own rules to get Jesus on the fast track. That's the key word for this early section. They fast tracked his trial. They took him, somebody who up until that point had not been a nuisance, and not that he was a nuisance. Rome didn't know about him. They maybe have heard some rumblings about him. But it's not like he was out there instigating things like Barabbas did. Barabbas, ironically, had started a rebellion and had murdered somebody and had robbed. He was a robber, a murderer, and a rebel. You think Rome knew about him? I think Rome knew about him. He was in custody for doing those things. Jesus was only handed over because the chief priests and the Pharisees were envious of him. And when you're just envious of somebody and you don't have any evidence against them, the evidence against him is super weak, and you can't prove anything in court. And that's what we're going to see here. So the Jews, they take him to their court, to Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest. Then they take him to Caiaphas, who was the high priest. They do this monkey trial, say, you're condemned, and John doesn't go into that. The other Gospels do, about what, they literally had to bring in witness after witness after witness. Keep in mind, this is in the middle of the night. So they grabbed Jesus at night, they arrested him at night, and then they have this trial at night, all throughout the night. And I think the trial only lasted as long as when the daylight came, that they could send runners out across town, as it were, to where Pontius Pilate, who, by the way, Pontius Pilate, just from reading, Pilate normally stayed in, I think it was Caesarea. He's the governor over that whole area, right? He's like the big guy. You have Herod, but then you have Pontius Pilate, right? He's the governor he's the Roman governor over all that area. He didn't normally stay in Jerusalem. He only stayed there because of the Passover feast. So he was only there in his governor's mansion because of the Passover. So all these events, kind of come together all at once. And so they led him, I read about 4 miles, they led Jesus from the high priest's, headquarters, all the way over to Pontius Pilate. And as soon as the morning broke, they had already alerted Pilate to come out and see what they had this prisoner that they had. And so verse 28 says, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Praetorium. The Praetorium is the governor's headquarters, where he stayed when he was in town. And it was early morning. Notice John says it's not just morning, it's early morning. They wanted to get Jesus killed immediately. They didn't want to waste time. They wanted him to suffer the penalty of death, and they didn't want to waste any time on it. So it was early morning. He says, but they themselves did not go into the Praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So the Jews, clinging to the law, their law, somehow they break these other laws, and yet they don't want to be defiled, so they're not going to go that far into a Gentile's area, right? Then I would have defiled them. They would have had to have been purified for 7 days, whatever the law called for. They would have had to have skipped the Passover. The irony is just off the hook here, because here you're breaking all sorts of laws to put somebody who's not deserving of death to death. That's already against the law. Well, we're going to see that this has kind of been going on the whole time Jesus was butting heads with these folks. That they had already been hypocrites, and that's what he called them in Matthew 23. And so he says here, Pilate then went out to them, and I think Pilate had already been alerted, so he was kind of had got dressed and all that, because it is early morning. Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? It's kind of a no-brainer for me. Because you have all of this, a multitude is what another the gospel says. A multitude of chief priests had walked with Jesus, and he was bound. And now they're pushing him forward, and now Pilate comes out to see him with his entourage, right? His guards. And they meet outside of the Praetorium. Because remember, the Jews couldn't go in there. So they meet outside. And now they look at Jesus. And remember, what we didn't record is that they kept hitting Jesus. Right, so he's been roughed up a little bit. And so clearly he's bound, clearly he's a prisoner, clearly they're there to, and he'd already been alerted that, hey, we have a prisoner, we need you to deal with him. And so the very first, and Pilate, you gotta give him credit, he's good at his job, okay? He's there, he's just the facts man. That's what he is. Just give me the facts. I don't want to hear your side of the story and he said, she said. I just want the facts. And that's really what he tries to get to. He doesn't want to hear about the Jews' religion. He doesn't want to hear about, so-and-so, stubbed their toe on my, couch or something. He wants the facts. And he wants to know, what accusation do you bring against this man? If you could dodge a question, this is what the Jews did. I've been watching a lot of politics this year, okay? Politicians are really good at dodging questions. Really good. They don't give him a straight answer. He says, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, if he were not a criminal, we would not have delivered him up to you. What? Is this the Congress? Is this the Senate floor? When you're asked a question? Is this a debate? I don't know. Philip likes debates. But they didn't answer the question. All they said was, well, he's a criminal. What did he do? Right? They still didn't answer him. Well, Pilate quickly realizes some things. He says, Pilate said to them, well, you take him and judge him according to your law. He's just a facts man. They didn't give him any facts. Get him out of here. You take him, you judge him, and he knows about their law. I mean, this jurisdiction is the Jews. He knows about that. It says, therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. What? You not only didn't tell me what he did, and now you're seeking the death penalty? That doesn't make sense. What in the world did he do? See, in our system of laws is built a lot on the Romans. What in the world, that doesn't make sense to us, it doesn't make sense to him either. And so, that the saying of Jesus, then Pilate said to them, you take him, you judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. He specifically said, we're not going to read it, but he specifically said that he would be betrayed, which has already happened, and turned over to the Gentiles and crucified. That's what he said. So it wouldn't be at the hands of the Jews, it'd be at the hands of the Romans. Crucifixion was actually a Greek way, the Greeks invented crucifixion. The Romans perfected it, because the Romans came after the Greeks. And so he specifically prophesied that he wouldn't be put to death by his own people, he'd be put to death in this way by the Romans. And so he says, then Pilate entered the praetorium again. So he went back to his governor's mansion and said, I'm going to have to sort this out myself. So he called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? That's all he had to go on. That's all. He didn't have anything substantial. That to him was nothing. Here is a king, and I want you to consider this. Pilate has power, okay? He even says, he references that. He has power. He's been given power by his higher-ups and their higher-ups, all the way up to Caesar. He's been given power. And this is his jurisdiction. He knows what power is. Caesar knows what power is, as far as earthly power. They're no stranger to that. Isn't that what the centurion says? I say, go over here to that man, he goes. He says, come over here to that man, and he comes. They're at his command. He knows what it is to have power. And so you have Pilate sitting in the place of power. And you have this man who claims to be a king, who claims to have a kingdom, who claims to have servants who can fight. And he's sitting there and he's bound. Pilate must think this man is just crazy. And absolutely no threat to anybody. He doesn't think Jesus is any kind of threat. So this is what Pilate is observing. Remember, he's just the facts. Now the Jews know who he claimed to be. We know who he is. We know that he is a king. We know that he has a king. We know that he has the power. Pilate doesn't see that. Pilate sees a man who's been broken and bound, talking about a kingdom. where? Right? So this isn't making sense to him. And so he asked him and said, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you concerning me? Oh, he got right to the heart, didn't he? Do you think Pilate had any clue? He's just repeating what they told him. Pilate answered, am I a Jew? I think he sneered that, by the way. I think he disdained those words as they came out of his mouth. Am I a Jew? I have no dealing with you guys, not like that. I'm a Roman. We have all the power. And so he says, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? To get to the bottom of it, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. The statement makes sense to us. The statement was hogwash to Pilate. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? It's the second time he's asked him. Jesus answered, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Comma, Pilate, that's the reason you don't get these things, because you're not of the truth. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And notice he doesn't wait for an answer. He says, and when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. I can't find any reason why this man should be put to death. In his mind, maybe he needs some help. Maybe he's just off in his own world. But from Pilate's perspective, he has the things that are deserving of death, like a rebellion and robbing and murder and all that, versus just the words that he's speaking. See, Pilate, he's not making any sense. So now he's got to reconcile with what they want, the Jews, and with what the law says. And guess what wins? So let's quickly go over to Luke chapter 23 for some insight. Now we see here that Pilate says, I find no fault in him. First he tried to get them to go away. That didn't work. Then he interrogates him himself and still says, I don't find any fault in him. Let's look at verse 13. He says, then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, you have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people, and indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning the things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. 2 magistrates have both said he doesn't deserve death. It's got to tell you something. It's got to tell you that Jesus didn't deserve death. Jesus willingly went to the cross to die. He didn't deserve death. See, he says, I will therefore chastise him and release him. I'll do something. Clearly, just to appease you, I'll just chastise him. I'll just get after him a little bit. And I'll just release him back to you. I'm not going to kill him. Verse 17, for it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. Why? Because that was the Jewish tradition. It says, and they all cried out at once, saying, away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city, and for murder. Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called to them, but they shouted, saying, crucify him, crucify him. They have him where they want him. They finally got him. They have him bound. They're not going to miss the opportunity to finally do away with him. Now, these things were done in haste because the Jews feared the multitudes. Pilate, on the other hand, fears what the Jews will do if he doesn't crucify him. So we're going to see, actually, I turned too quickly, back in Luke 23. This is kind of the final straw here for Pilate. Then they said, 22, then they said to him the third time, then he said to them the third time, why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him, and I'll let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified, and the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. They were just louder. They were more insistent. They were going to cause an uproar. And to a Roman, that meant you weren't doing your job. You could easily be replaced. and you could be imprisoned yourself. Keep in mind what happened in Acts when there was a uproar. Remember that in Acts? The whole city was in an uproar over Paul. And the leader of that city, the Roman leader of that city said, look, we're in trouble here. We're potentially going to be in big trouble with the Romans. If they come in here, the higher up Romans, if they come in here and say, what's going on over here? You know, Romans were big at stamping out people and their rebellions. They weren't about to have one in their own jurisdiction. So the Romans were big on order and all that. And they were all over a potential uprising. Well, that's what the Jews were threatening to do, is to make a scene. And Pilate's like, okay, well, I guess I can't do that. Okay, so then back in John, I just gave us some more detail, I think, in what happened. Verse 39 says, but you, and this is that big word, but you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews? That's what he named him, you know. Then they all cried again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So from John's perspective, he remembered that he was a robber. Luke's perspective, he remembered that he was a murderer and he incited a revolt, a rebel. And so what we see is that he was all those things. He's probably a looter and all those other things. They would rather have that man than Jesus. And so the Jews evaded Pilate's basic question: what did he do? They went right for letting him know that they wanted the death penalty. They forced Pilate's hand to try and determine what exactly he was guilty of. So they said, Pilate, you figure out you just figure out whatever you think he's guilty of, and we're going to back it up. Well, Pilate, of course, could find no fault in him because there was no fault in him. And peer pressure was at work in both cases. You have the Jews as well as Pilate. The Jews were under peer pressure from the multitudes, mostly because of the good works that he did. They're doing this not out in the open. They couldn't just go up and arrest him during the day. They feared the multitudes. So the peer pressure was working on that end, and peer pressure was working on Pilate's end. He wanted to please the Jews at the expense of one man. Well, he did the math, like, well, I could either have an uprising and my neck's on the line, or I could just give in and just crucify this one person.
And Jesus was nobody to him. It's not like he felt he was valuable.
Right. And it says in another scripture that Herod, no, John doesn't cover it, but Jesus actually went to Herod, because when they came to Pilate first, Pilate said, oh, he's a Galilean? Well, that's Herod's jurisdiction. So he ships them off to Herod. And Herod was anxious to see Jesus, is what it says. He had heard about the miracles and all that. Well, when he went to Herod, Jesus didn't say a word. He was completely quiet. And he wanted to see a miracle done by him. No, he didn't see that. So then Herod said, okay, back to Pilate. Right? And so Jesus being bounced around and just fast-tracked, that's our word, fast-tracked on the way to his death penalty. With no rhyme or reason. Laws are being broken everywhere. People are staying up all throughout the night just to bring him to his end. And so this in turn made sure that his superiors believed, Pilate's superiors believed that he was doing his job of keeping his jurisdiction in order. That's what Pilate feared, was that somebody would come down. So let's go over to, we're in 19. The decision has been made, and actually the decision quite hasn't been made yet. Remember when Pilate said that he would basically chastise him, then he still wanted to release him? He knew how angry the mob was, so he wanted to appease him a little bit, and that's when he took him. And in chapter 19, verse 1, it says, so then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And then verse 2, and verse 3, and verse 4, right? I always look past verse 1 as if it's just nothing. Do you know what scourging is?
No.
I had to look it up myself. I kind of had a clue, but do you know what it is involved? See, that's what I want to read today. And I don't want to, this is something that 20 years ago, I did the math, 20 years ago, in my sophomore year, my teacher read this, the medical description of what Christ went through on our behalf. And that always stuck with me. Always stuck with me. And we can read these scriptures, we can look, and this is what this author says, you know, we can wear the cross around our neck, we can look at a stained glass window of Jesus on the cross, and it's just all glory, and it's not all glory. And what Jesus did for us on the cross, and what we're going to, you know, our next section of John really gets into, was the suffering of the Messiah. And it makes crystal clear to me the struggle that Jesus had in the garden that night. It makes crystal clear why he was struggling in the garden that night. The things that he suffered. So we'll just read a couple scriptures here. So he says, "So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe." Remember, these events are in order. Why is that important? We're going to see. "Then they said, 'Hail, King of the Jews,' and they struck him with their hands." So these are the Romans doing this. This isn't he's been turned over now. This is what they wanted. He's been turned over to the Romans. The Roman soldiers knew what they were doing. They've been doing this. This isn't their first rodeo. When they were given an order, chastise this man, scourge this man, get him ready for his crucifixion, well, they knew what to do. And they included a little mocking in there too, just for good flavor. And they struck him with their hands. Now, what we don't see is that he's blindfolded at this point. That's what another gospel gives us. "Pilate then went out again and told them, 'Behold, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know I find no fault in him.'" Do you think that's good enough? Do you think it's good enough when they see Jesus in the condition that he's in? They're going to say, "Oh, the Pharisees, all right, he's had enough." No. Crucify him. Get rid of him. That's why we gave him to you. And so, we're going to read a little bit. I read two accounts. It's kind of difficult. I get kind of, just if someone describes a surgery or something, I kind of start to black out. I'm just that kind of guy, okay? So, I've gotten a little bit better, but honestly, and this is not sensational. This is real. This is real. This is what really happened. And so I think it helps me appreciate the Lord's suffering in everything that he experienced. And so this guy says this is a more accurate account of the crucifixion. So it says a medical account of the crucifixion. So he says hanging, electrocution, kneecapping, gas chambers, these punishments are feared. They all happen today, and we shudder as we think of the horror and the pain. But as we shall see, these ordeals pale into insignificance compared with the bitter fate of Jesus at the hands of the crucifixion. So it says, few people are crucified today except by ISIS and other various terrorist groups. For us, the cross remains confined to ornaments and jewelry, romanticized pictures, statues portraying a serene death. Isn't that true? But was that what the Romans intended for that to be? No, definitely not. So it says, crucifixion was a form of execution refined by the Romans to a precise art. It was carefully conceived to produce a slow death with maximum pain. It was a public spectacle intended to deter other would-be criminals. It was a death to be feared. Remember that night that Jesus, and only Luke accounts for this, but it talks about Jesus sweating that night in the garden. Right? We would know why better after we read this account of why he was sweating. Luke 22:24 says of Jesus, "And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." I used to think, I changed my mind a couple years ago on, it's not actually blood. It became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. The sweat was unusually intense because his emotional state was unusually intense. Dehydration coupled with exhaustion further weakened him. Note, the scriptures nowhere say that Jesus was sweating blood. And so, keep in mind that when you perspire, what's the first thing you want? Liquid. When you're out there and you're running around in the heat and you're losing water, boy, you get thirsty pretty quick. If it's basketball, if it's just running around, if it's whatever. Well, Jesus, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because later on, Jesus says on the cross, I thirst. He had been dehydrated. He had been completely drained of those fluids the night before because of his great emotional state, making him produce this sweat. And so, have we ever sweat that much? And we've sweat. It's cold sweats, right? When you're about to get in trouble or something, right? And everyone knows that feeling. But there's a loss of liquid and it hasn't been replenished. And so they say that that's one of the worst things you can go through is dehydration because all of your cells in your body are crying out at the same time for water. So do you have
I
something?
think Psalm 22, did it say that the tongue cleaved to his jaws?
Yeah, dry mouth and all
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So it was in this condition that Jesus faced the first physical abuse, punches and slaps to the face and head while blindfolded. Unable to anticipate the blows, Jesus was badly bruised, his mouth and his eyes possibly injured. You don't know. Where's the punch coming from? Where's it going to land? You don't know. The psychological effects, and this is something that he brings out that we have to take into account. The psychological effects of the false trials should not be underestimated. Consider that Jesus faced them bruised, dehydrated, exhausted, and possibly in shock of the false trials. And this is where we're going to get to, Brother Brian, flogging or scourging. In the previous 12 hours, Jesus had suffered emotional trauma, rejected by his closest friends, a cruel beating, and a sleepless night, during which he had to walk miles between unjust hearings. So you have the Jews at the high priest, and then he walks miles, after he'd already been roughed up, over to the Praetorium. Despite the fitness he must have certainly gained during his travels in Palestine, he was in no way prepared for the punishment of flogging. The effects would be worse as a result. A man to be flogged was stripped of his clothes and his hands tied to a post above his head. We've all seen that. Right, with that, we can picture that. He was then whipped across the shoulders, back, buttocks, thighs, and legs. The soldier standing behind and to one side of the victim now. There was the actual soldier with the whip, at the end of the whip, well, he describes it. But then there was another man standing off to the side who was in charge of observing the one getting punished, the one being flogged, to make sure that he wasn't going to die. He was the one making sure that he'd had, quote, enough, just before death. So there was two involved. The whip used, the flagellum, was designed to make this a devastating punishment, bringing the victim close to death. Several short, heavy leather thongs with two small balls of lead or iron attached near the end of each. You know how dense and heavy lead or iron is? Very, very heavy. Pieces of sheep's bones were sometimes included. This is what it actually did. As the scourging proceeds, the heavy leather thongs produced first superficial cuts, then deeper damage to underlying tissues. Bleeding becomes severe when not only capillaries and veins are cut, but also arteries and the underlying muscles. The small metal balls first produce large, deep bruises which are broken open by further blows. The fragments of sheep bone rip the flesh as the whip is drawn back. When the beating is finished, the skin is back. The skin of the back is in ribbons, and the entire area is torn and bleeding. Like I said, we can read this. Jesus was flogged. Or we can read it. And I hate understating things sometimes. I think in our society it's just what we do. You know, it's emotional for me, and it's emotional for us. So the words chosen by the gospel writers suggest that the scourging of Jesus was particularly severe. He was certainly at the point of collapse when he was cut down from the flogging post. And that's when he reappeared to the Jews. And that's the kind of condition he was in. Jesus was allowed no time to recover before facing his next ordeal. Made to stand, he was dressed in a robe by jeering soldiers, crowned with a twisted band of thorny twigs. and to complete the parody, given a wooden staff as a king's scepter. Who remembers that from other Gospels? They put a reed in his hand. Can we see why he's angry coming back? Can we see why he's not happy when he comes back? They're mocking him. He's a rightful king of a rightful kingdom, and they're mocking him. And Barabbas, if they would have done that to Barabbas, according to the law, he deserved it. Jesus didn't deserve any punishment. So he says, next they spit on Jesus and struck him on the head with the wooden staff. The long thorns were driven into the sensitive scalp tissue, producing profuse bleeding. But even more terrible was the reopening of the wounds on Jesus' back when the robe was torn off. Who remembers if you put a cloth or something over an open wound and you rip it off? Can you imagine that on your back? They put the robe on and they ripped it off. Further weakened physically and emotionally, Jesus was led away to be executed. The wooden crosses used by the Romans was too heavy to be carried by one man. Instead, the victim to be crucified was made to bear the detached crossbar across his shoulders. We can picture this, right? Picture this. Carrying it outside the city walls to the place of execution. The heavy upright portion of the cross was permanently, though the upright portion was permanently in position. There's no way somebody could carry all of that. It's just too heavy. Jesus was unable to carry his load. Do we understand why a little bit better now? So we can read these words, like I've said, but sometimes they just don't make sense. All of them. Yes, we believe them, but why? We don't have executions like this. We don't know what this is like. It's not our society. You know, and people don't get flogged anymore in the Western society. We just don't know what it's like. So he says the beam was weighing around 75 to 125 pounds. He collapsed under the burden, and an onlooker was ordered to take it for him. Have you ever seen felt where your muscles just can't do anymore? You tried. I was working out one time with my boss, and something about like zeroing out. I think he said a muscle. We were lifting weights, and I'll never do that again. Lifting weights, and all of a sudden it's the weirdest feeling. Your muscle just gives out. It's just weird. Just like, whoa, gone. It's like my tricep or something, right? Well, Jesus' muscles, they just gave out. You can't possibly carry that burden any longer. And so Jesus refused to drink the wine and myrrh offered to him before the nails were driven in. And in parentheses it says it would have dulled the pain. Thrown down on his back, with his arms outstretched along the crossbar. Nails were driven through Jesus' wrist into the wood. These iron spikes, about 6 inches long and 3/8 of an inch thick, severed the large sensor motor median nerve, causing excruciating pain in both arms. Carefully placed between bones and ligaments, they were able to bear the full weight of the crucified man. So this was down to an art. The Romans knew what they were doing. They had done this before. This isn't something new. In preparation for the nailing of the feet, Jesus was lifted up and the crossbar fixed to the upright post. Then with legs bent at the knee. Why would you bend? We've all seen this with Jesus on the cross. His knees were a little bit bent. Why would you bend the knee? There's a reason for it. A single nail was used to pierce both feet, one foot being placed over the other. You know what this looks like from pictures. Again, there was severe nerve damage, and the pain caused was intense. It is important to note, however, that neither the wounds to the wrists or feet caused substantial bleeding, since no major arteries were ruptured. The executioner took care to ensure this so that death would be slower and the suffering longer. They had it down to an art. They knew what they were doing. Now nailed to his cross, the real horror of the crucifixion began. When the wrists were nailed to the crossbar, the elbows were intentionally left in a bent position, so that the crucified man would hang with his arms above his head, the weight being taken on the nails in the wrists. Obviously, this was unbearably painful, but it had another effect. It is very difficult to exhale in this position. What happens if you don't exhale? We breathe in oxygen. We breathe out gases that we can't breathe in, right? If that gets trapped in your lungs, that's not good. In order to breathe out and then take in fresh air, it was necessary to push the body up on the nailed feet. When the pain from the feet became unbearable, the victim would again slump down to hang by the arms. A terrible cycle of pain began. Hanging by the arms, unable to breathe, pushing up on the feet to inhale quickly before again slumping down, and on and on and on. This tortured activity became more and more difficult as Jesus' back was scraped against the upright posts, his muscle cramps set in because of the inadequate respiration. Exhaustion grew more severe. Jesus suffered in this manner for several hours. With a final cry, he died. He was not murdered. He was willingly able to give up his spirit. He wasn't murdered. He did this on his own accord. No one took his life. He said, I have power to lay my life down, and I have power to take it up again. Pilate said, and we're going to read this, I have power to release you, and I have power to crucify you. Really? Pilate has that power? Jesus had that power. And that's why when they came to him on the cross, they were still on the cross. And once again, because of the law, the Jews requested that these prisoners, Jewish prisoners, don't hang up there because of the Passover. Who did the Passover represent? The one they were crucifying. That lamb that night in Exodus that they had to kill and they had to spread the blood over the doorpost, that was just a lamb. The power was Jesus. Over 1,000 years later, however long it was. And it was Jesus on the Passover. There's no question this is on purpose. Jesus was the Passover lamb that day. And so, it said many factors contributed to Jesus' death. A combination of shock and suffocation killed most of the victims of crucifixion, but in Jesus' case, acute heart failure may have been the final trauma. This is suggested by his sudden death following a loud cry after only a few hours. Well, 6 hours on the cross? That is amazing. It seems that Pilate was surprised to find Jesus was already dead. A fatal cardiac arrhythmia or perhaps cardiac rupture are likely the candidates. So Jesus was already dead as the executioners broke the legs of the criminals. Remember, it wasn't up to the soldiers to come over and break Jesus' legs and then cause him to not be able to push up anymore and then suffocate. Okay, that's why they said let's speed this along, break the legs of the prisoners. They didn't have to do that with Jesus because that would be in their hands. Jesus willingly gave himself up. No need to break his legs. He gave up his spirit. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Jesus was already dead as the executioners broke the legs of the criminals crucified alongside in order to speed up their deaths. Instead, we read that a soldier pierced Jesus' side with a spear. He asked the question of where on his side. The word chosen by John suggests the ribs, and if the soldier intended to make Jesus' death certain, a wound to the heart was the obvious choice. From the wound came a flow of blood and water. This is consistent with the spear blow to the heart, especially from the right side. And the soldier would have been on Jesus's, if you're looking at him, he's on the right? So he's putting the spear into his left side. Rupturing the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, released a flow of watery serum, followed by blood as the heart was pierced. And so, that's how our Lord went to his death. You have something?
It was also prophesied that none of his bones would be broken.
And John makes sure of that. Which is interesting because, it's very precise. And if you read Psalm 22, we probably don't have time to read it today, but if you read Psalm 22, it's a description of hanging on the cross. Hundreds of years before it ever happened. So there it is. Yet his bones won't be broken. So it's almost like this very delicate balance of exactly what's going to happen to him. You have something else?
Well, we look at everything that Jesus suffered physically, but he also did that under the weight of sin too, taken away from the world. And I think that's another reason why he's gonna be so angry coming back. He did all of that, he endured all of that, you know, of course, without doing any wrong. And most people today, you mention the name of Jesus and they mock him. You know, you go around, it's no big thing, even in children's cartoons now, you see the Lord's name being taken in vain repeatedly. It's just, it's become so dumbed down, so dulled down that this incredible, probably the most suffering that anybody could actually endure without passing out or dying, that, you know, it makes sense why he's gonna come back
Vengeance.
with vengeance, yeah.
And that's the thing, is that we can't ever underestimate, sure, there's been others that have been, you know, crucified and all those other things, but nobody has ever endured the amount of psychological and spiritual burden that Jesus did. Nobody. Nobody else has ever taken away the sins of the world. No one else has ever borne those sins on his shoulders. Nobody. And so we have, like, that's a good point, Noah. I mean, not only was he, you know, bearing these things without guilt, but he's bearing these things alone. Everybody had left. There's John, right? But everybody else scattered. And even John was kind of flying under the radar. So he did it with a broken heart.
I mean, when the Lord turned his face from him.
Yeah.
Like, that was signifying, I could be wrong, but I think that was signifying the moment when he was completely alone in that burden.
Yeah. Yeah,
Wasn't that
there's-
because that, I mean, Lord can't look upon sin, and Jesus was
the embodiment of it? Yeah.
at that moment.
He felt utterly alone. He felt utterly alone. And so, back to our scriptures, we can try to wrap this up just a little bit, or as much as we can. I just, you know, to me, I don't, like I said, it's been 20 years that I've even heard this, the actual description of the crucifixion, and I didn't want to go another 20 without reading it. I mean, it's good to be reminded. It's very good to be reminded. And just look how short verse 1 is of 19. So then Pilate took Jesus and just scourged him. What does that really mean to us? Brian, you didn't even know what it was. I didn't really know. I didn't have all the details. I bet you if we were honest, we wouldn't know everything about what that really was like. But Jesus did it. Just because it's a little verse in the Bible doesn't mean it wasn't enormous to Jesus. And the implications for us that he went through that for us are huge.
If you've seen The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, I think that probably came the closest to the graphic reality that you're trying to portray. The whipping scene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even Hollywood has to stop, you know, at a certain point. And when Joseph of Arimathea and even Nicodemus, later on in the chapter, when they come and get him, take the body of Jesus, he wasn't recognizable.
Mm-hmm.
There was blood everywhere. They probably would not have known who it was had it not been the sign of the cross that it was Jesus.
Well, I was just thinking too, along with that physical aspect, you know, there's a certain point where the body as a natural defense mechanism will just shut down, you know, completely lose consciousness, and even after being up all night and enduring all that suffering, I don't recall a single time being recorded where Jesus passed out or closed his eyes. You know, he went way beyond what just about anybody could do, as far as that was concerned.
Yeah.
You know,
But how many of us would have way past the breaking
Oh,
point?
yeah.
How many of us would have
Completely out.
So, verse 5, then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, behold the man. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. We got him where we want him. Now we just need to finish the job. Pilate said to them, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. He's giving them an out. He's giving them the ability to do a Roman punishment on his authority. He really does not want to do this. And what we didn't read was that the night before, Pilate's wife had had a dream warning him about Jesus. Don't have anything to do with this man. And that's when Pilate was already on edge about this because of that. And so Pilate really does not want to have anything to do with Jesus. And so that's why he said again, I don't find any fault in him. Well, the Jews, they were prepared. They had an answer if Pilate was going to waffle. Pilate waffled, because why do you want to condemn a man to that cruel death if he's not guilty of anything? Remember, he's a just the facts man. He doesn't care what truth is. What is truth, right? The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. Who am I really talking to here? And went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, where are you from? Jesus gave no answer. Because by then, he'd already had the crown of thorns. He'd already had the robe. He'd already been flogged. He's not really in the mood. He just wants to move along. What's he going to say? He's not going to just give his testimony at that point. There's nothing he can say, and he knows that he has to go through with it.
Yeah, he
He's
didn't
quiet.
want it to stop.
No. Let's just go through with it. But he does muster an answer here in a minute. Then Pilate said to him, are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you? Jesus answered, I can just picture his barely being able to speak. And when we read the words when he speaks on the cross, never read him in a normal voice. It's not possible. To be able to, knowing how labored each breath is, and to be able to say the things that he said. He said 7 things on the cross, and we can cover that one time. 7 things. Labored to speak at all. And so he's able to get this out. Jesus answered, you could have no power against me, at all against me, unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. From then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Uh-oh. What did Pilate fear? Oh, they knew his fear. His fear was the upper echelons of Rome and their government. He says, you're not Caesar's friend if you let him go. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat him down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, so about noon. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. He's just trying to get them. So look at the man. I flogged him. He's a mess. We just let him go. Look at him. Behold him. Look what I did to him. I can have some mercy on him. But they cried out, away with him, and away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. That's a lie. A lie. Where was God in all this? Oh, it's convenient. You should say Caesar's your king when it's convenient. Then he delivered him to them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. So Pilate did everything he could. Everything he could. There was no convincing the mob. And so we'll get into the rest of it next week. That's, our word was fast-tracked and unjust, and for Jesus to bear what he bore makes me appreciate a little bit more what he did. I think it helps us put things in perspective too. Christ didn't have to do that, and yet he did. Anybody have anything else?
He just says, now take up your cross and follow me.